So this is a third of our series, third session of our current series, but I was saying earlier, we don't know what's going to happen with this as we move forward. We're going to have some meetings about that, whether we're going to just continue the series with more speakers, or we're going to take a step back and formalize it in some different way and come back with a more formal program. We haven't decided, but we know there's a lot of assessment expertise in this province that we have yet to tap into, and a lot of thirst for assessment topics, obviously. So today we're going to talk about rubrics and exemplars, and Rob Sidley is going to lead us off in the discussion, and hopefully it's going to generate some ideas, some thinking, some conversation, and some questions. So over to you, Rob.
Thank you. I'll just share my screen here. And Peter, that look okay? You can see that swanky looking keynote. Okay. All right, welcome everybody. So we're going to do a sort of a bit of a deep dive into some rubrics and some exemplar ideas. I'm sure that the concept of rubrics and exemplars is not new to anybody, but I just want to share a little bit of my journey and my thinking around it, and a little bit of some backstory and a little bit of what perhaps is some rationale for why this is, I think, really an excellent way to help do what I think we're trying to do here, which is, I think we're all pretty secure with how it is that we assess or evaluate the procedural operational tasks like tests and quizzes and things. And then there just seems to be this other thing, right? This slushy kind of problem solving way of getting kids to engage that we're not quite as comfortable with how to assess that, either how to grade it or what feedback we give kids around it, what form that takes. It's just not really part of our background as math teachers, or our history or culture as math teachers, to do that. So I'm hoping to kind of try to make that stuff a little bit less fuzzy today. And we'll see how that goes. So I liked what Mike did last week, which was to just sort of start out with some foundational principles. And so I thought that I'd do that. This is a foundational, that's sort of an anti-foundational idea. Okay, so I'm going to start out with like the opposite of a foundational idea. But this quote is, okay, the whole process of becoming competent in any field must be divided into a very large number of very small steps, and reinforcement must be contingent upon the accomplishment of each step. This solution to the problem of creating a complex repertoire of behavior also solves the problem of maintaining the behavior in strength. By making each successive step as small as possible, the frequency of reinforcement can be raised to a maximum, while the possibly adverse consequences of being wrong are reduced to a minimum. Now, if that sounds familiar to me, because I think that is an idea that I sort of came into the math teaching profession sort of with, and heard a lot around this idea of atomizing the content. In fact, we hear some of these ideas that still sort of exist in some practice out there. And that quote is from Skinner, who's a behaviorist. And I think that some of these foundational ideas are part of, I think, what is perhaps the dominant 20th century paradigm for education. And it sort of exists as sort of three big ideas that sort of blended together. And that is this curriculum of social efficiency, which is we just wanted schools to look like factories. We had this hereditary theory of intelligence, IQ or innate, and some of that still persists, right? This isn't necessarily, we're out of the 20th century, but there's a lot of this that still persists. We hear, I'm not a math person, or my mother's an engineer, so I must be good at math too. We still have a lot of these things. Assessment-wise, there's this notion that we can measure or sort of legitimize education by objectifying or seeking to measure outcomes, measure learning, and try to be objective about that. And that's was really dominant. I came into teaching sort of in the last 10% of the 20th century, and this was pretty much it. We were there. There's been a shift though in this, hopefully, and that is much more towards, oops, I have frozen here. There we go. Sort of different paradigms here. A vision of curriculum that is centered on all of students being able to learn, enacting democratic practices. I'm not going to go through all of this, but what I like about the notion of classroom assessment here is that what we're really trying to do is to challenge the notion of it's not just about processes, it's not just about learning outcomes, but about learning processes, right? Higher order thinking, learning is ongoing, it's visible to students, and used to elevate teaching as well as student learning. Sort of the big foundational ideas for me around that shift is that for me, it was a big move from thinking about assessment as measuring something to thinking about assessment as the systematic gathering or the gathering of evidence. And if you think about that sort of paradigm of what it is that we're measuring, I don't think that there's much that we can measure. We're certainly not particularly good at it. Maybe if you're a psychometrician or something, that's your specialty, you get better at it. But just as sort of your average high school teacher, we're not really good at measuring that kind of stuff. I think more around the idea of what is it that I'm gathering? How am I collecting evidence of those things that I think are important? I think another really important idea that sort of guides me is we're not passive observers of learning. It's not as though like I'm standing on a street corner and I'm counting like all the red cars that go by and I have no part in what's happening. We co-construct the assessment experience with our students. We are inextricably linked to and entwined in that experience for them and with them. So this notion of being objective to it is fallacious. We just aren't. We are as much a part of that assessment experience as the students are. And I think the more we embrace that, the reciprocality of that is really, really important. We're learning with them. We're impacting their learning through their assessment. And in fact, this notion that instruction and assessment are separate, I also think has been a big shift in my thinking. It's almost impossible for me to separate the idea of assessment and instruction. They're so intertwined. I couldn't tell you that this was something that, you know, I'm teaching now and I'm instructing now and I'm assessing here, and they're just inseparable. So it just sort of gets us started on the right place, just positioning myself. This is sort of where I'm coming from. I also liked what Mike did around getting you to do a task. So I'm going to get you to do a problem solving task right now. You're just going to do it for about 3 or 4 minutes to just gain some context for a discussion we're going to have about some student work. So here is the problem. I don't want to do any comments or answers or anything like that, but oops, came out of that. Let's try that again. Here's the problem. Here are the first 3 cases of a growing pattern. I'm going to call it the claw problem. How many circles are needed for the n by n case? Okay, so you got the first case there, the second case there, and the third case there. How many circles are needed for the n by n case? A couple of minutes, 3 minutes, see if you can figure that out. What is happening here? La, 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 la. There we go.
Rob, can you put it back up?
Yeah, sorry. I'm just
That's okay.
I'm trying to manage the Zoom thing, and I wanted to sort of see the chats, and so there it is. Sorry, I skipped ahead a little bit.
Your screen stopped sharing.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
Here. that better? Okay.
Rob, did you want us to start submitting, or did you want to do this like waterfall and wait until a special moment to see them all at once?
I'm going to let you just sort of hang on to that thought for a second. I'm going to hang on to those answers. So I'm going to,
Okay.
what I really want you to do is to just not have to look at a student example of this work cold. So I just want you to sort of get into it a little bit. So let's just move forward. And what I'm going to do is show you a student solution to this problem. And this time, what I'd like you to do, we will do a comment fall on this. So I want you to do is have a look over the solution. For those of you that are on phones, I think it's going to be a little bit hard to see. Maybe you can zoom in. There's some smaller writing on it. It's student work. So, but in a couple of minutes, have like 3 minutes or so to have a look at it. And then what I'd like you to do is type a comment. You can type a comment anytime, but don't hit send until I tell you to, so we don't get distracted by the comments coming in. Just tell me what it is you notice about the student work. Okay, so here's a student solution. Here we go. Sorry. I am again keep popping out of my screen sharing thing here. There we go. Aha. So one, maybe two things that you notice about this. You can start typing your comments, something that you notice about the student solution, something that interests you, attracts your attention, and you can just hold on and don't hit send yet. Give you a moment to type. Everyone's going to copy Chris's now. I'll cover it up. All right, and when you've got your comment written, just hit send, and let's take a moment and just read some of the comments in the chat. They did have counters, yes. Okay, so here's a meta question for you as you read through those comments. I agree with all of them, of course. Those are things that you've noticed, but just a meta question about the comments. What do you notice about the comments? What do you notice about what you noticed? And you can just jump in and say something or write a comment about the comment that you notice about the comment. Multiple layers of meta here. Okay. We like color. Teachers, we like color. We're math teachers, we still like color. Yeah, and so one of the things that I notice is we notice a lot of things. There's a lot of things that we notice. Some of them sort of cluster around competency, some of them cluster around aesthetics, some of them cluster around representation. We're noticing a lot of things. So I want to give you another task here. And that task is this. I'd like you to have a look at these little gingerbread people for a second. Okay, and what I'd like you to do is, okay, you had a little look at that. So I'm going to put them on in a second, in a minute again. And what I want you to tell me is how many of the gingerbread people have their eyes open? Okay. What I actually want to know is how many of the gingerbread people were wearing scarves? So I can't see the comments are lost. So, but maybe you noticed that, or maybe you didn't notice that. But it's hard to notice things unless we're sort of focusing our attention on them. And one of the things that, in fact, I think it's, here, I'll open the chat back up. Oh, I should probably show you. Greater than 0. Now, it might not have been something that you noticed the first time, especially because I redirected you to focus on something else. There was this other thing was happening over here. But this is really, really an important idea. And I don't want to get too far away from our rubrics and exemplars, but learning to see things in a particular way is very, very important to what it is that we're doing. And we work in a field, in a teaching profession, obviously, that has a very, very complex perceptual field. There is a lot of stuff that's going on in front of us all the time. And sometimes we notice some stuff and sometimes we don't notice stuff that's going on. And I think part of our job, Proust says, the real voyage to discovery consists not of seeing new landscapes, but in having new eyes. Well, how do we learn to see those things that we might not otherwise have been able to see? Now, when it comes to noticing those things in our classroom, we know that there's a big difference actually between how novice teachers, beginning teachers experience this and more experienced teachers. We know that younger teachers notice things and describe those things that they notice in the classroom through narrative. They tell a lot of stories. Oh, this kid today did this, or the kid that did that. There's a lot of stories. What more experienced teachers notice are examples of things. So more experienced teachers might say, oh, a student did a thing in my classroom today, and here's why that's important. Here's why I noticed that. More experienced teachers are able to organize those things that they see in terms of a particular way of coding, a particular way of making sense of those things. And this notion of what it is that we see in this very complex perceptual field, for example, that first student sample that we saw, there's a lot to see there and there's a lot to discuss there. And I think part of what helps, or part of what makes evaluating or assessing students' work that looks like that complex is we're not entirely sure where to look, what we're seeing, or how to sort of code that information in a way that organizes it for ourselves and for our students. Okay, so I just want to, I'm going to segue a little bit into a story about a biker bar. And I want you to imagine that you're, getting a little older and you decide that you're going to buy a Harley, maybe grow a beard. No, this is not maybe it is. I don't, okay, I can't hide it. And just so you decide that you're going to, ride your Harley up into Kelowna, and you're gonna wander into like a biker bar, Hell's Angels chapter biker bar in Kelowna, and park your Harley out front and walk in. How long do you suppose it would take for the people that are in that biker bar to realize that you don't belong there, that you're an outsider? Okay, turns out it took about a second and a half, and they booted me out. So what is that? What's happening in that? Because I think you would probably agree that just because you might be wearing sort of the leather vest and have the Harley outside, the people in that biker bar might notice something that they might notice that you're wearing more fashionable glasses, or you're wearing Gap jeans or something, instead of something that you might not notice because you're not a part of that community. So what we're really getting at is this notion of discipline-specific literacy. And Paul Guy, who's a sort of an author on this topic, this discourse analysis, looks at this idea and says that every social community has its own way of acting. And the literacy that it takes to belong to that community is more than just language. Literacy involves more than just language. It involves the way we act, the questions we ask, the way we think or perceive in those particular moments, not just our clothes we wear, how we carry ourselves, the kind of discussions we have. All of that stuff makes us members of particular communities. So just like biker bars or knitting clubs, or or anything else, or lawyers, mathematics has its own discourse. So what is it that we're looking for to help people become members of this community, so that when they talk, the questions they ask, the vocabulary they use, the way in which they engage, have them resemble and participation in this particular community? So there's a lot of places we can go to look for that stuff, and I'm not going to bore you with a lot of details around it, but definitely the NCTM standards have principles of practice and standards of process standards that talk about what it means to engage in mathematical discourse. The Common Core framework in the States has that. There's also, again, discourse analysis. And we have our own version of that here in BC in terms of the curricular competencies. The curricular competencies are ways to describe what it means to do mathematics, right? To be a member of the community of mathematics, because we recognize that it's more than just a matter of being able to perform long division, or being able to perform, convert something into slope-intercept form, or find an asymptote. That's part of it, but that doesn't, that's, buying a Harley and parking it outside. That doesn't actually make you a full participant in a community of what it means to do mathematics. So we've got this wonderful discourse-based framework of curricular competencies that help us to organize ways in which we might be able to see or perceive or code that very complex perceptual field that we exist in every day. How do we notice? What do we notice? I noticed in the comments earlier that someone said that a lot of the things that we were noticing were based on curricular competencies. Yeah, some were. The more precise we can be about that, or the more intentional we can be about that, the more we sort of move from this fuzzy, we're going to do problem solving and put this sort of in a problem solving bin, to more of the stuff that Mike was looking at last week around how he's organized his, his assessment bins, or his assessment tasks. So I want to send you back to this task that we looked at a minute ago, but I'm going to do the gingerbread activity. I'm not going to trick you this time, though. We're going to look at it specifically. So let's look at this. But what I want you to do is, I'd like you to look for let's choose representations. In particular, what I'd like you to do is to look at how this particular student has represented their mathematical ideas concretely, pictorially, symbolically. Okay, so let's focus a little bit more on that. Let's look at the work, and again, let's take 2 or 3 minutes to just look at that bit. And then when I say go, you can write a couple of comments down about your what you observe around that or what you notice about their representations. All right, and maybe when you think you've got something to type out, you can start typing it out. Don't hit send yet. All right, go ahead. If you've got a comment, something about representations, you can hit send. Okay. Yeah, great comments. I agree with all of them. Yeah, it's a good question. I don't have an answer for whether or not I just have an interpretation about whether or not the first version up in the top left is they're not physically counters. They've represented the counters, but there's something different perhaps about those than what they've done underneath. But again, interpretation. That's all I'm doing, is just looking at it and interpreting it. And again, they're filling in with things that might have been counters. They did have yellow and red counters working with this. Interesting, yes. So let's do something. Let's do this. I'm going to show you another student example. Okay, but think about what you're doing, of course, is you're taking this complex perceptual field, you're zeroing in on something, you're abstracting that one idea out of it, you're looking for something in particular in this. And let's look at another student example. And again, this is a little bit smaller and harder to see. I'm going to start to see everyone lean a little closer to their screens. Another student example of the same problem. So let's do the same thing. Let's look at representations. In a couple of minutes, we'll have a few comments. All right, and if you're ready to start typing some comments out or a comment out, you can go ahead and hit send. And maybe as you're reading the comments, you're noticing things that other people noticed that you hadn't noticed yourself, which is, of course, the benefit of doing this collaboratively. I knew I would lose you completely if I put you in breakout rooms with these two solutions. It would be it. We'd be done. I'd never get you back again. They're particularly interesting. Something happens when we look at two examples, right? Not only do we practice abstracting that particular thing that we're looking for, but we can't help but compare them, because not only do we see, we're able to see the representations, but now we're able to see two versions of the representations and automatically compare them in some way. What I'd like you to consider is, if the first student had had a chance to see this exemplar before they did their solution, what do you think they might have added to theirs? And you're welcome to just, comment. Yeah. Oh, I didn't know you wanted us to do another. Oh, I didn't know you wanted us to do, right? And sometimes I don't even know, what it is I'm looking for. But oftentimes when I get some stuff in from students and I see something, go, oh, wow. Oh, I should have asked for that. Of course I wanted that. I had that in mind all along. And then I go back and regrade all the other stuff. So, right. Yeah, the multiple representations here are awesome, but that comparison between the two, one of the things that's interesting, I think, is that when we were talking about that complex perceptual field, there's a lot of things to see, and there's a lot of different ways to see them. Okay, there's a lot of things to see, and there's a lot of different ways to see them. And I feel like that big idea encompasses or encapsulates the notion of rubrics and exemplars for me, is this idea of there's a lot of different things to see, so I have to figure out what I'm going to look for. And my students need to know what it is that I'm looking for, but also what it is they need to be doing. And looking across different examples helps students and us see what it is that we might be looking for. Right? So rubrics help organize, or they code a field of view, so we can focus attention not just on necessarily like something that's very complex. Oftentimes kids are working on the boards, or kids are working on a big problem, and again, it's just, I'll look for something. Maybe I'm pointing out accuracy, maybe I'm pointing out notation, maybe I know it really helped me to decide on those things I was going to focus on. It really sort of channeled and became clearer in terms of what feedback I was giving students. It also helps to sort of focus the direction and the effort on improving a particular thing, especially when we're pulling in stuff that is, rather nebulous, right? It's fuzzy around the edges. It's not as clear cut as an equation solution or some of our test questions that are more procedural. And I think more importantly, it helps to enculturate students in terms of engaging mathematically. And the language of the rubrics, the language of the aspects of the rubrics, those the categories start to get picked up in the classroom. Kids start talking about their representations. They talk about their communication, their strategy, their reasoning, the connections. They start using that language, and it becomes the language that I use as I'm giving feedback on the fly for students, perhaps working on the boards, because it's helped me code what it is that I'm looking for. Exemplars, right? They help you identify the benchmarks or the anchors of performance. So this is a good example of something that is really particularly great. Like this is a good example of that. And it helps clarify for myself, but also clarify for the students, because I don't know sometimes what it is I'm looking for until I get some stuff. I go, what? I think I have an idea. You know what? I do a problem and I go, oh, this is what I expect to see from the students. And I get this, you know, soup to nuts of work from students. Then it helps me to organize and categorize that. The concrete examples of what we're looking for are really helpful. So I showed some rubrics, and I'm teaching a Education 211 right now at SFU, and I showed some rubrics of past work of students' journal entries and students' problem-solving logs. I got them to do problem-solving logs, and the comment and the feedback I got from the students was really positive, because they had already worked a couple of weeks on this on these assignments, and I showed them some a couple of exemplars. And it just came alive to them. They went, oh, okay, now I can see that what I was doing was here, but what you're looking for is here, or more importantly, here's how I can make my work more like this work, right? Here's what I need to do to identify the next steps, which is part of that directionality of the feedback that we need to give students, right? Where are you? Where do you need to go? And oftentimes when we're doing problem solving work like this, it's hard to describe that. So again, the rubrics help us to you know, to code that and describe that to students. So let me give you a couple of examples of some rubrics. I don't love any of these in particular, but they're just ways you might want to consider organizing some rubric ideas. So this is very pictorial. You notice that across the top, this particular rubric is just organized in terms of 3 categories: understanding the problem, strategy, reasoning, procedure, and communication. And then this particular rubric identifies 4 different versions of proficiency, right? Novice, apprentice, practitioner, expert. Again, I'm not advocating that language. It's just one way to consider it. I think 3 is a nice place to start around these things. You're welcome to get more sophisticated. This particular example has, you know, 5 of those discursive categories: problem solving, reasoning, proof, communication, connections, right? And again, with the 4 categories. I do like the visuals though. This is written in student language. So it's interesting with rubrics. I spent some time generating rubrics with students and using a lot of their language around it. And I think that that's a really important idea, that the students get a chance to describe what it is that they think is important about work. What I'll often do is you know, put up an exemplar and ask students, have a look at it. What do you think could be improved on it? And we can sort of generate some categories. I want to be careful around that, though, that I don't open the field up to valuing things that are sort of outside of those discursive practices. I want to make sure that I'm landing on those things that are important and not sort of going and turning the rubric into a scoring guide. What I mean by that is, you know, you've got an introduction, or you've restated the problem, so that's worth 2 marks. You've started the problem, that's worth 3 marks. You've rewritten the problem in your own words, that's worth. Those are much more sort of tick the boxes sort of scoring guides. I don't feel like they're really you know, aligned necessarily with discursive practices like the curricular competencies. They're too specific. They don't quite give enough space for kids to be creative and get messy and sort of get better in things. This is a different sort of version. They've got the categories up at the top with some, again, 3 organizers. It's written in student language. And then there are some that are super complicated. This is not one that I would necessarily use at all. I don't feel it practical, but it might be something that someone might include in, for example, a course outline, or perhaps something sort of at the end of the term to evaluate that's really, really specific for particular levels and descriptions of problem solving, reasoning, improved communication, etc. The one that I've tended to use is this one. And again, I'm not in love with it. I just sort of found that it was pretty practical. And there's a couple of differences with this one. One is you'll notice that I've just identified some things in the sort of the proficient category, or sort of that middle category. I don't talk about 4 or 5 different categories. I just sort of think 3 is pretty good. And then it's more open for me. I'm less of a fan of the boxes, because I don't feel like oftentimes the work fits exactly in one particular place. So I like the open number line kind of idea. A few bullets that just describe what students are required to do, or what that looks like. And then how I might code it would be something like this, where I might do broader bands or shorter bands, and something that's, something that doesn't necessarily fit nicely inside of a particular cell. There's lots of different ways to do it. I think most importantly, it's starting with what it is you feel like you can see. Starting with what you feel like you can identify. Because when we went back to one of those other ones where, super detailed, I don't know, and I certainly, when I started doing this, almost certainly I could not see those different aspects. I didn't know if I could see 4 or 5 different aspects of 5 different categories. And it takes time to learn how to do this. How do students know what extending looks like in terms of the criteria or wide detail proficiency? So for this particular thing, yeah, so there's, again, they're not standalone rubrics where there's no conversation afterwards. If I'm giving this back to students, there's conversations about what that can look like to help move them forward. And again, Phil, this is a great way for your sort of performance standards to be brought into here, right? If you've got those sets of what does extending look like, if you've got examples of that. Also, the exemplars that we're using, right, I agree that that the extending part is extending beyond the question, but not necessarily going to the next grade. Sometimes it involves that, but that's not necessarily how I'd interpret that. So here are some strategies, I think, for sort of fine tuning these ideas. Unless you're super old, you're going to be teaching in 3 years anyways. You may as well be better at this than if you hadn't started. So just set a 3-year plan. What's it going to look like? I think a really nice idea, one of the things that I did was I just picked 3 exemplar tasks where these were tasks that I was going to get students to do that I wasn't necessarily going to use for parts of their portfolios or anything like that. I just chose 3 sort of iconic problems, and I got the students to do the problems. And the first job is to sort of collect a bunch of student samples from these problems. You're collecting the student samples. You may not be doing anything with them, but you're just collecting them, going through them. You've got lots of potential exemplars, and start looking for those ones that really speak to you as being, oh, this is, I would consider this to be a really good example. I don't know if I understand that question. So, but I think the more of these student samples that you see, the more of these examples you see, you're going to be able to see more things in them. This is an example of, for example, this is an anchor example. So for example, this is a a piece of work that somebody has coded as being an apprentice, and they've got some ideas. They've sort of described why they consider this to be an apprentice. I don't love this because what I like the idea of de-aggregating. I don't like the notion of a particular thing being an example of an apprentice piece of work. I would much prefer if in terms of the representation, it is this, or in terms of the communication, it's this, in terms of the strategy, it's this, so that we're not sort of just looking at a particular work and saying that it's in one particular group, it's this. The anchors I think the anchors sort of represent three versions. So here's an anchor extending, here's an anchor proficient, or here's an anchor developing. So you've got those sorts of, sort of three versions of the particular problem. And then showing those, again, asking students what it is that they see that could be improved as they start moving towards the, and then where the work that they've done fits on that, sort of that notion of a clothesline activity, perhaps, that you'd say, well, I can see that my communication, I could get better at this, but having them see that really helps them to identify those next steps. Yeah. This is ideally done with a department where you're not just sitting alone, sort of trying to figure this out. Ideally, bringing 2 or 3 student samples of a particular problem to a department or to a group, sit down and just talk about what it is you see. Is this one, like which one is the direction we want students to be doing more of this or more of that? And that's it's personal in that you are developing those notions yourself in terms of what it is that you can code and what you can describe, but we get the validity of that from the resonance that comes with discussing that with other teachers. We as a department agree that this sort of what the student has done here fits here. Before we just take some questions in a second, I just wanted to talk about a couple of different resources. Rethinking Letter Grades is a great book that helps that transition from letter grades to non-letter grades or percentages, and how we might make that bridge. And Exemplars and Rubrics, the Exemplars, some of the examples came from that. I think it's an online resource, and it's downloadable. So sort of just wrapping things up before we go to sort of discussions and chats about this, that I feel like when we're talking about the curricular competencies and the performance standards that Phil and Mike talked about, we've got the curricular competencies in those in sort of the way in which we've categorized the things we're looking for. Okay, those discursive groups or those bins of what it is that I'm looking for, curricular competencies, and then the performance standards help us with those. What does emerging, what does extending look like if you've got anchors that describe those things that are going to evolve over time. But we haven't done a lot of this as part of our training to be math teachers. Say we're really good at figuring out whether a test paper or a particular question that a student has answered on on a test gets 3.5 out of 4 or 3 out of 4 and those kinds of things. But when students start handing in work that looks more robust, because we're giving them opportunities to do tasks that allow that to emerge, it's much harder to sort of figure out where students are. It's messy, but the more we do it, the more we're able to see, right, from that very vast, complex perceptual field, the way we start to code things and they emerge, and we get better at it. We just got to train ourselves to do it. And ideally, we're not doing it in isolation. Collect a lot of student samples. Those three sort of iconic problems that I do, maybe do one from number and one from shape and space, maybe one from probability or trig or something. And I just keep those from year to year. And then when I get students to do those problems, they're part of the practice of doing the problems. So then they do the problems, we show the exemplars. And then from there, that bridges towards them doing problems that that I don't necessarily have exemplars for, but we're still talking about what makes something better, what makes, you know, that sort of direction of improvement. So beyond that, that's sort of what I have to say about it. And I'd love to hear some comments and questions. Again, just part of my journey and helping to make less fuzzy those things that we think are really important, which is the discursive practices.
Thanks, Rob. You certainly gave us lots to think about. So let's start talking to each other. Let's start asking questions and making comments. Feel free to use the chat or just turn on your mic and ask Rob a question.
Hi, thanks, Rob. I've tried doing these kind of things over the year, and it's definitely a work in progress. And one thing that I've noticed that happened with my classes with younger grades was like a transfer from one exemplar to a new task, where when the new task is quite a bit different from some of the exemplars they've seen, they can have a really difficult time seeing or figuring out what it is that I'd be looking for. So that's something that I really have to work on. And I think by focusing more on the curricular competencies, I think that would probably be more suited for this kind of thing, because I'm not exactly sure how to say it, but that's just my kind of feeling is stepping away more from the problem. So I think when I was doing more from the angle of problem solving. I think maybe in the exemplars I had curricular competencies, but probably in my words, I was more kind of focusing on how to solve the problem. And that's the thing that they were really struggling with, transferring from one task to another. So that's something I've noticed, and just something to think about when people are trying to design their own exemplars and tasks.
Yeah, but I think that's really where the important piece comes in, right? Is that transference. So I can do it with this particular task, and then as I try to do it for another task and I'm not quite as successful, that really helps us to try to figure out what it is that we're not transferring. So what is it that we been able to abstract that particular idea and then generalize it across tasks? So representations, for example, right? So even for ourselves. So and that's why I think the first part of training, the first part of learning is for us to be able to do it, to go, okay, what does representation look like, or reasoning or strategy look like across these three different kinds of tasks? If I can describe it for myself, it's much easier for me to be able to describe it to students, and they do get better at it. But especially when they're not, it's the activity before Christmas, or that it's incorporated as part of the everyday. Those three anchor tasks are not the only time students are doing problem solving. For my class, they were doing them, like it was an integrated part of almost the everyday classroom experience. So that language emerged as being the language of assessment in the classroom.
Yeah, and I think like that idea of working with your department, it's so crucial too, because it's a long extended process, right? Even for myself, working through like Mason's book, it took me weeks to wrap my head around it. And I'm like a fully fledged adult with lots of, skills at my disposal. So for young kids, this is a long process and it's worthwhile pursuing, but it takes time and investment from not just one teacher.
Kind of building from that, Rob, and this idea of like over time and seeing their growth and so on. So like, are these, because I saw how you had indicated on that particular rubric, which I think would have been, for that task, this is what you saw. But is there still like an overall kind of, where are you at in terms of this growing body of evidence with respect to those things that you're looking for?
So adopted a portfolio assessment model. So what I would do is, so a student by the end of a term, for example, might have 3 or 4 of these problem solving write-ups or something where I've coded that for them. And when it comes time to the sort of the evaluation, part of the course, that's always involves a conversation for me. We start looking at the portfolio. What have you improved in? What's the most recent? It isn't a one size fits all. Like, it really depends on where the student is. And so when we're looking at those and saying, okay, well, where has this growth been? What are the goals for you for the next task? Here's an outlier, in this particular task, your communication was lousy, but the other ones, it's fine. So, I'm not going to, average everything out to that. So I looking at growth over time, having the students reflect on whether or not they are meeting the goals that they've set out for themselves as we progress, and then trends emerge, right? Stagnation or this kid's really good at representation, but boy, their communication is kind of poor. So now we kind of know what we're looking for. But if they're not things that just happen 3 times a year, they're things that are ongoing, it gives you something that you work on an ongoing basis with the student.
Yeah, thank you.
Again,
That's good thinking.
back to that idea that the assessment and the instruction is inseparable, right? That it's not, the assessment is the event, and then all this other stuff happens, and then they get assessed, and all this other stuff happens. It's just this constant fluid dynamic of, what are we working on? What are you doing? This looks really good. Do you want some feedback from me around it? Hand it in ahead of time. I'll give you some feedback. Give it back to you.
Right.
All about
it's the idea that assessment isn't a moment. It's a journey. It's a process. It's an ongoing. Yeah, I like that.
Which calls into question the metaphor of assessment as a snapshot, right? Like that terminology is just so detrimental to the way that you're talking here, right? I just want to throw in a comment there. It's not a question or anything, but this came out of my own work, and it's about the really important connection between exemplars and rubrics. And that I found in my work that if I wanted to have students co-construct rubrics with me, or the language for rubrics around behaviors, things like collaboration and so on, we could do that without exemplars. But anytime I wanted to co-construct rubrics or language for rubrics around anything that was a producible, something that the students had to produce in whatever medium they had to produce it, we needed exemplars in order for them to even begin to participate in the co-construction of rubrics. And it was such a clear connection that I don't think it's arbitrary that these 2 topics ended up together here. And Rob stitched a very nice continuum between them, and I just wanted to add one more thread there.
It's very difficult to look at, even though, to the I think there was a question about, well, what does it mean in the language, and how do you acquire this this extending version? And if I just looked at the description, like, I don't really know. As a student reading those, I don't know what to produce. How do I know that I've gone beyond something or extended beyond something? What's the something that I'm extending beyond? Unless I have something that I can make concrete for myself. Go, oh, that's what you mean. I can see it now. If I can see it, I can sort of start to head towards it and recognize that I can see the delta between where I am and where I might need to go. And that might not be from, proficient to extending. It might be from, emerging to developing. It might be at some step, but at least it identifies some actionable, some movement where I can conceive of it as a student. I can see what I need to do. I can like look at it, and I'd be identified. And as a teacher, I have language, because I've started to work with this. I have language to describe that, as opposed to, not being able, and I certainly found myself kind of going, well, it's not very good. And but I don't, it's really hard for me to describe why. I don't know why. How do I get you to, well, do more of this or something? And I felt really, feels really inadequate to be able to do that. But I think the more that I've collected of students' work, the more I've looked to try to abstract and code it based on these discursive sort of the curricular competencies, the better I'm able to identify the difference between representations or strategy, logic, reasoning, right? Reflections, those sorts of things start to emerge, and I start to be able to see them again on the fly as students are doing work. And it gives me language to help them go from here to the next step. It's a little bit of the life of an English teacher in way. I know that Melanie is here somewhere, and where, you know, who's my partner, and who's an English teacher. We talk a lot about this, in the idea of how we, you know, it's you got a mark an English essay, describe how someone goes from here to get it better. Well, it's just your ideas aren't quite cohesive, and well, give me an example of what that is. It's much slushier in those sorts of areas. We've gotten off a little bit easy in math with our procedural test writing, right, where it's a little bit clearer cut. And now we're sort of entering that more nebulous phase of describing how to help students qualitatively improve, and that's hard for us. We're not good at that. We don't have a lot of experience with that. And so this is part of what I'm trying to lay out as a framework for perhaps getting better at doing that, by collecting a bunch of work first and really looking at it for just 3 big chunks. What do I see here?
Rob, how do you
Not very well.
how do you, yeah, not very well. I got to finish the question. I don't ask the question very well either. You know, somebody come up with this idea of non-permanent vertical surfaces and people working in groups, which is, I'm wondering how that all works with the rubrics when you have people working in groups and you're trying to look for particular things within the groups, and how you collect that data, if that's making sense. Like how does all that mesh together from a practical sense within a classroom where you have kids kind of all over the place and stuff? How do you handle that, I guess, is what I'm asking.
Well, I think one of the things I noticed when I moved to a thinking classroom model was how quickly I figured out a lot of stuff about my students. You know, when they're up and they're talking and they're engaging or not engaging or stepping back, or the way they're in 3 or 4 classes, if it even takes that long. And I know Peter and I have done workshops where we stood in the back of the room and just watch teacher and go, yep. And we just start to almost instantly see archetypes in some cases of performance, and go, aha, reluctant, watch their back, look at their body language. And so I think for me, that's, of course, that's assessment data, right? I'm not, it's not formal, but it's assessment data. And so I'm starting to trying to figure out who my kids are, and then contrasting that to perhaps a more traditional stand and deliver classroom where, you know, it could be 3 months before I get a kid to actually talk and say something in class, and I don't know who they are. So first of all, it really helps to get to know who they are, and so I have to put them in situations that provide productive crisis for them, so that they can, you know, their characteristics emerge, and I can start to go, okay, I've noticed something. You're right, we're good. We see patterns really well. You need a little bit of this, you need a little of that. And by the time we're a week to 2 weeks into a class of doing thinking classrooms, I kind of have a sense of what kids are, where they are, what they need, and their characteristics, their personalities. So I can start to fine tune some things. So then when we do some group work, so I like the idea of doing, you know, the group work, for example, to work collaboratively on a problem, painted cube problem, or they'll do, you know, even this claw problem, they were working collaboratively, but then they went away and did individual problem solving write-ups. And so the way I structure my problem solving write-ups is it involves, you know, a narrative voice. It involves telling the story about what happened and when they were solving the problem. Perhaps they have a screenshot of some, you know, here's what we did on the board, or here's what we did on the table. And then here's our solution to the problem. Here's what we did. Here's what I did. Here's a contribution. Here's my understanding of the problem. And here's some connections. And so inside of that, yeah, it's blended with collaborative and individual, but, you know, I don't care. You know, what they've done is theirs. They've produced something that's based on that has its origins in collaborations, which is everything that we do, right? I might be teaching individually in my classroom, but what I'm doing in my classroom is the product of collaboration of my years of working with colleagues. So how do I separate what I do versus what I've taken from other people, right? It's part of just that practice of how do we engage. And so I don't feel like I need to discriminate so much between what is individual and what is collaborative. I don't typically collect collaborative work like that. Like I don't typically collect a piece of writing that a group of 3 people has done together. I'll get them to work collaboratively, but then they'll be doing something individually, which consolidates that the work that they've done collaboratively.
Yeah. Do you ever use those that collaborative work though as exemplars of what really good work is? Like in terms of having the groups go around and look at each other's work, or if you were to give them the claw problem, like I could see some students getting to the point where the second version was that you shared collaboratively in a group, much quicker and probably laid out better in some ways as a group than they may individually. So if they're looking for an exemplar on the I guess upper end side, that may be a way to get there. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, and one of the things I've done on vertical surfaces is I've had students work on I had the students in groups of 3 work on problems, and then I've done a carousel where a student takes a different colored pen, or I give out the red pens or something like that, and then the groups go around the room and either annotate or amend or make suggestions to other people's board work in terms of how it could be improved. You could explain this a little bit better. I'm not sure I understand what you did here. You might want to check this, for accuracy. And then, so they're getting experience again with the language. What are we looking for? How is their communication, right? Do you think they've understood the problem? Do they need a nudge in terms of moving forward? And that's powerful and really efficient work at getting better at using this language and helping kids identify this stuff, right? Do that a couple of times, and all of a sudden, what happens to their work when they're doing it, right? It's really a good value-added task to help them. They're assessing. They're also coming back to their work that they've done collaboratively, which is the best work that they can do as a group, and then going, aha, I could do this next time. I could do this next time.
Yeah.
So I feel like that's a task you may want to consider.
Thanks.
I haven't been monitoring the chat, so if someone has a question in there that I haven't answered, dive in.
So Rob, I guess what I'm wondering is what's in your portfolio, because we're kind of having a side chat about what the role of a teacher is. So currently I use electronic portfolio like FreshGrade to collect evidence. So I take those pictures, but I'm also recording where they are on my rubric. What are you doing with yours? Like you're talking about showing growth over time. Are you collecting those as well, or are you just noting the growth?
Yeah, so so my portfolios looked, sort of specific, and what I had students, I had 3 components to my portfolio. And again, this is just a particular model that I landed on in a particular year with a particular group of kids, and it's maybe or not generalizable to anybody else, or even to myself in another iteration of my my life in the classroom. But what I did was I had 3 sections. One was a content section, one was a problem solving section, and the third was a reflection section. So the content section involved, stuff from the textbook, homeworky stuff. What I got students to do was to sort of encapsulate big ideas of the particular that term. So if we were working on linear equations, or we were, students were doing, okay, here's an example of a linear equation. Here's what I did with it. Here are some examples of homework questions I did with it. So the portfolio was sort of an event. They did pull together and produce something for me at the end, which they could use previous work that they'd done. The problem solving section was to to hand in, I think it was 2 or 3 problem solving logs of all of the problem solving work that we've done throughout that term. They chose 2 or 3 exemplars, 2 or 3 of what they considered to be their best work. And they handed that in as part of their portfolio. And then there was a core competency reflection, or reflection that connected to the big ideas, because each one of the terms sort of was attached to, students will use algebraic thinking to generalize, so how did this term connect to that? Give me examples of how the work you did, how you've met those outcomes. That was sort of the official portfolio. So it was really we've done a whole bunch of stuff. The stuff that we do throughout the term may or may not be included in your portfolio. That's kind of up to you. I've got a few things I need to see, included. The problem solving things, choose your 2 or 3 best ones. And if you want to improve them from when I've handed them back to you, that's awesome too. So it was always about this notion of continual growth. But I never wanted to give the idea, of course, the end of the course is different, but give this idea that no, we're done now, that's stopped. You can't improve on this anymore, especially because the things we're working on were discursive. They carry over throughout the entire year, right? It's Peter and I have talked about this a lot, but this notion of sometimes we move from chapter to chapter to chapter to chapter, never to kind of return to know whether or not a student has gotten any better at anything that we did at the beginning of the year. But if we're focusing on the mathematical engagement and discourse, that threads through the entire year. And so if I'm focusing on those things, I can track and see growth from September through to December or January, or I don't know, September 1st to December 4th, or whatever quarter system we're in right now. I don't know, but yeah.
Okay, that helps. Thank you.
Yeah, I just like the idea of that portfolio being something that is it is the collection of what the students have done, and it doesn't need to be everything. And I'm more than happy to have them hand in a subset of the work that they've done, because you can't do your best with everything, right? Not everything can be your best, right? Your best is by definition the best of everything that you're doing. So, no matter how good you are, you do 10 things, one of them is going to be the best, the top 3. Doesn't matter how good they all are. You can't always do your best. And so I just say, here's the stuff we're doing, hand in the things that you want to demonstrate. And, there's lots of opportunities to describe, like, what is it about this you like? What do you want me to notice, right? How have you improved over time? Linking those in with the core competencies in their reflections and connections.
And I think that if the students are brought into the discourse that you talk about, Rob, then they become more autonomous as agents in deciding what goes into the portfolios. It's we spent a long time having portfolios be a menu item that we have specified that the students have to put in there, because they don't understand the discourse. They don't know what the purpose of the portfolio is. They don't know where they are in their learning and what it is that they have done that can exemplify something that they haven't yet evidenced to you. So all of this, again, tying together with the rubrics and the exemplars and bringing them into that discourse so that the students can become agents in participating in the portfolio as something that is a place for them to evidence learning. Emily, go for it.
Rob, I really appreciate the 3-year project piece, just in terms of giving grace for not understanding necessarily what we're looking for the first time. I really appreciate that framework. I know for myself, I've enjoyed creating some really cool projects this year. And because they're new, I don't have exemplars, and it's cool to see what the kids come up with. My personal challenge is I have 4 classes doing the same project. So as you see all these exemplars, your ideas change, and then clearly you can't go back and reassess everything. You just have to commit to what you've decided your rubric is going to be the first time around. And I think that's probably the most challenging piece in my particular situation, as opposed to just having a set of 30 and committing to that rubric and however you're going to assess that first piece. I guess my follow-up question, I don't think makes sense for you because you're doing the portfolio piece, but curious to put it out to the group around, does anybody have any strategies for turning particular rubrics into marks? Do you just like to then put in your grade book? I'm still in the in-between performance or standards-based grading and points-based grading. I'm still in that shift. So I'm curious what other people's thoughts are around that and strategies you have for rationalizing that.
So I'll actually comment on the first thing first, and I'll leave that to the field for the second one. But that the notion of I have my rubric set, and now I've collected a whole bunch of things, and I wish I could kind of go back. Well, boy, isn't that a microcosm of just teaching in general? I mean, I want to go back and reteach every student I ever taught with all the knowledge and experience I have today. And it's just this constant sense of evolution where I just go, oh, I so did it wrong last year or last week, and it's just that's just part of it. And the idea that you're recognizing, I think, as work is coming in, those things that went, wow, that's a great example, and I should have or could have somehow directed students towards that. Good, like that's learning and growth. And I think we all know some colleagues that have had the same rubric or have had the same version of something that were still on sort of the purple rolly sheets, and things haven't changed very much. But I think that constant evolution. I have blended the marks and the rubrics before, and it's always, it's the best guess. I always say to the students that I will give you the highest grade that I can possibly justify. That's it. I give you the highest grade I can justify. It's this. I can justify this. I don't know about this one, but the grade conversation is always about, here's what it is now, but what do you need to show me next time? What are you working on? How do you move that? If you want to move it up, how do you move it up for the next time? Let's set some goals for that, so that there's hope and optimism to move forward, so that they're not just going, oh, I got a 80 and that's it. That's the end of the world. I'm just always an 80 student. You're always in transition. The 80 is really informative because it tells you with a conversation what that 80 means and how that moves forward to something else. But I'll leave other people to chat about it too.
Thank you.
Here's an idea of something I've seen a lot of teachers do, is that, and this is in response to Emily's question, is that the first thing you do with your students is a sacrificial activity, in the sense that it's not being marked. So we do the first activity, and then from the exemplars from that, we co-construct the rubric for the next activity. So you need that one throwaway to seed the environment. I've seen many teachers have a lot of success with that, no matter what it is they're doing in that rubric building space, needing exemplars before the rubric is built.
I've also used exemplars on the fly from other classes, so if I've got two blocks of the same thing and I've got one coming in, I'll just swap them in again on the fly. Let's just have a look at what came in. Let's talk about what could be better for next time. And again, that I think I like the idea of the three sort of anchor ones, where they're not necessarily problems that I'm going to give them for marks or for their portfolio. They're throwaway ones because they're the anchor ones. They're the ones that are going to be the three versions that they're going to do them, and then I've got the exemplars for them. But
maybe it's pushback or just clarification on your example there, Peter, of a sacrificial thing. Like, I don't know. I think it's through this lens of assessment, nothing is sacrificial. It's part of their story, right? And it's part of the evidence that this is where you were and this is how you've grown and where you've gone. And it's not like it's a mark in a marks book that's going to linger there and have an impact for the rest of the rest of the course. So I don't know, I think it's still part of the learning story, and it can be a valuable piece of evidence.
I agree, but in the sense that I'm not going to assess it right after it's done. So they do the activity. We see this in language arts a lot. We have students write something, and then based on what they've written, we co-construct a rubric. And then they have that rubric to either rewrite the work they've already done or to write the next piece. That initial piece, that first draft of that thing that we use to seed the space, isn't what is being assessed by the teacher, but the student can choose to include that in their portfolio or self-assess it using the rubric, and so on and so forth. So it's just sort of, that's a terminology I use, and maybe it's not the right term, but it is.
I get it, yeah.
Yeah.
There's a lot of freedom, and there's conversations about the anxiety that students feel. Boy, when they know that not everything they're doing is going to be included or marked. Now, everything they're doing is going to be assessed in some way. I'm going to comment on it or give them some feedback on it, but not everything that they do has to be like, if I don't do my best, if I don't get a 99 on this one, I can't go home and tell my parents or something. The freedom and the what happens in terms of their the way in which they're engaging in the course, they just relax, and they go, if they kind of mess it up this time, it's okay, we'll just do better next time. And again, it's not just these big, we're only doing this twice a year, we're only doing this 10 times a year because it's tests, and you got to do your best, or it's the end of the world.
Well, we're getting close to the end of the time. We do have time for one more comment or question, I suspect.
I have another one. I have two things. I was just thinking about the how the kids are feeling during it, and their viewpoint of you as a teacher. I had to do part of a staff meeting, so maybe you covered this already, but do you find that the way they view you as a teacher, normally we are the holders of all knowledge, do you find that that has changed a lot with this implementation?
Yeah, I think my students, so 5 minutes in, realize I'm not the holder of much knowledge at all. So I can't hold that one, over their head for very long. But yeah, I think just this notion that we're co-constructing an experience here. I'm not directing them. They're not sort of meeting my expectations. We are working together towards something. I like the, there's a, you've heard the sort of the sage on the stage versus the guide on the side sort of paradigm of teaching. And I think the one I like for myself is I always feel like I'm the director of a play, and the students are the actors of the play, but they haven't read the script, and I'm sort of directing them through this this play that I know kind of the end of it, but they don't know it. And so it's like that discovery that I want to help emerge, with them. And again, we're just co-constructing this experience. Now I kind of know where it's going, but I can't tell them ahead of time or it ruins it, right? I'm not a fan of sharing learning intentions ahead of time, because I just like the emergence of that experience. We surprise them with what it is that they can do, or surprise them with some insight into some mathematical connection. And so I sort of see myself that way, and I think that changes the way I think, not just the way I'm perceived, but the way mathematics is perceived as being this thing that is done to students, as opposed to discursively done with students, right? If we focus on the discourse, we're creating this community of discursive practitioners in the room, talking like mathematicians and asking questions like mathematicians, because we've got that language. What do mathematicians sound like? They sound like this, and we're not even trying. Look at the problem solving, look at the language that's emerging from these things. So that's kind of the, my sense of inviting them into this discourse, and focusing not as much on the the procedural correctness stuff. The correctness is important, but the correctness is a byproduct of something. It's a byproduct of understanding and reasoning and strategy. And so I just feel like I'm some mysterious director.
Okay, thanks, Rob. How about everybody give him a round of applause, and thanks for everybody for coming. I'm going to